The summer of 1950 brought not only scorching heat, but also the echo of gunfire rolling across the Korean peninsula. For George Blake, a young officer in the British Secret Intelligence Service known as MI6, that summer was fateful. He was in Seoul, carrying out his usual duties, when suddenly, like a forest fire, the North Korean army swept across the country. The 25th of June, 1950, the day the Korean War began, changed his fate forever. The British Diplomatic Corps, to which Blake belonged, found itself at the epicenter of events, and soon he, along with other Western citizens, was taken prisoner. The gray, damp air of the Korean winter, chilling to the bone, became his constant companion. The ground beneath the prisoners' feet seemed to have turned to stone from the cold. Their faces, ravaged by hunger and sleeplessness, were frozen in despair. In such an environment, any spark of hope, any alternative idea could seem like salvation. Blake spent 3 long years, from 1950 to 1953, in captivity, which became a turning point in his life. It was not just physical captivity, but also a kind of captivity of consciousness, where, under the pressure of circumstances and targeted propaganda, his worldview underwent profound changes. In a prisoner of war camp located somewhere in the north of the Korean peninsula, he encountered the cruelty of war, destruction, and the death of civilians, which, by his own admission, caused him to become deeply disillusioned with Western politics. It seemed to him that the actions of the United States and its allies were nothing more than aggression, and the anti-communist rhetoric seemed hypocritical against the backdrop of the suffering of ordinary people. Captivity in Korea was not just a physical ordeal. It was sophisticated psychological torture, where cold, hunger, and disease served only as a backdrop for systematic ideological influence.
Blake, like many other prisoners, was placed in a camp where Soviet and North Korean officers, often graduates of special KGB schools, conducted so-called lectures and discussions. These sessions were carefully planned. They began with criticism of Western imperialism, capitalism, and colonialism, and then moved on to glorifying the Soviet system and its achievements in the areas of social justice, equality, and peace. Blake, who was already disillusioned with British colonial policy and had seen poverty and injustice in Egypt, was particularly receptive to these arguments. He saw the destruction caused by American bombing and heard stories of civilian casualties, which only reinforced his belief in the aggressiveness of the West. In his mind, Marxism-Leninism was not just a political doctrine, but a kind of religion that offered clear answers to all questions about the world order, promising a world without war and exploitation. He did not simply believe in communism, he became a staunch supporter, seeing it as the only salvation for humanity. His recruitment by KGB officers was most likely the result of his own initiative, his desire to serve a great cause, rather than banal threats or blackmail. He offered his services himself, driven not by greed, but by a deep, almost fanatical conviction. The details of the recruitment itself remain a matter of speculation, but it is known that Soviet intelligence agents skillfully exploited his disappointment and desire for a better world. They did not simply offer him cooperation, but presented it as an opportunity to serve a great cause, the cause of peace and justice, contrasting it with the imperialist ambitions of the West. For Blake, it was not so much a question of money as it was a question of faith, of finding new meaning. Thus began his double life, which years later would cause enormous damage to Western intelligence services.
After his release and return to the United Kingdom, George Blake was welcomed as a national hero. His stories of steadfastness in captivity and the hardships he endured only strengthened his reputation. No one could have imagined that behind this heroic mask lay a man who had not only changed his beliefs, but had also begun to actively work against his country. His return to MI6 was triumphant, and he soon gained access to classified information, becoming a valuable asset. His appointment to the department overseeing operations in Eastern Europe was a real godsend for the KGB. Blake gained access to information about hundreds of agents working in the GDR, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria. These agents were not just informants. Among them were high-ranking officials, military personnel, scientists, and dissidents who passed on information to the West about the Warsaw Pact's military plans, the economic situation, and political sentiments. Blake passed on not only their names, but also their code names, meeting places, methods of communication, passwords, hiding places, sources of funding, and details of their family lives that could be used for blackmail. For several years, from 1953 until his exposure, Blake systematically passed on the names of several hundred British and Western agents to the KGB. These people risked their lives working against the USSR and the Warsaw Pact countries in Eastern Europe. The information he passed on was exhaustive: names, meeting places, methods of communication, sources of funding. Every file that fell into the hands of the KGB, thanks to Blake, was a death sentence or prison term for one of the Western intelligence agents. The consequences were catastrophic. The information passed on by Blake led to mass arrests, trials, and in some cases, executions. The Soviet Party elite and the Soviet government had a unique opportunity to neutralize entire networks of Western spies.
Agents who had been gathering information about the Soviet bloc for years suddenly found themselves under surveillance, their communication channels exposed, and their operations shut down. This was not just a blow to MI6, it was the complete collapse of the UK's intelligence network in the region. It took British intelligence many years to restore trust and rebuild its operations in Eastern Europe, which was equivalent to losing a strategic advantage for a decade. The scale of the damage was so great that some historians call it one of the most devastating failures in the history of Western intelligence services during the Cold War. In the mid-1950s, when the Cold War was gaining momentum, the British MI6 and the US CIA conceived one of the most ambitious and daring operations of the time, Operation Gold. Its goal was to build an underground tunnel that would stretch from West Berlin to East Berlin, right under the noses of Soviet troops. The purpose of the tunnel was to tap into the telephone cables of Soviet military communications, as well as the communication lines of the East German Army. This promised unprecedented access to vital information about the plans and movements of the Soviet bloc. It was George Blake, a deeply embedded KGB agent, who disclosed all the details of this top-secret operation to Soviet intelligence in advance. He passed on information to the KGB about the plans, the location of the tunnel, its technical characteristics, and the timetable. This presented the Soviet leadership with a difficult choice. Exposing the tunnel immediately would mean revealing their most valuable agent, Blake. So the KGB made a strategic decision to allow the operation to continue. The Soviet secret services not only knew about the tunnel, but also actively used it to their advantage.
For 11 months, while American and British engineers and intelligence officers worked underground, the USSR transmitted carefully controlled and misleading information through these communication lines. Western intelligence agencies received data that seemed valuable to them, but was in fact either outdated or deliberately fabricated to mislead them about the true state of affairs in the Soviet bloc. The aim of this tactic was not only to protect Blake, but also to manipulate Western intelligence, giving them a false impression of Soviet military capabilities and intentions. When the tunnel was finally accidentally discovered by Soviet troops in 1956, it was presented as a great victory for Soviet counterintelligence. In reality, it was merely the conclusion of a carefully planned spectacle, with the Soviet side as the director and Western intelligence agencies as unwitting actors playing out someone else's script. Nevertheless, British intelligence services exposed George Blake. It all began when Western intelligence agents obtained information from defectors from the USSR.
One of them reported that there was an agent working in London who was passing secret documents to Moscow. The investigation narrowed down the circle of suspects to a few individuals. Blake raised more and more questions. He often went on business trips, took an interest in matters that were not part of his duties, and was too well informed about things he should not have known. To test him, intelligence officers set up covert surveillance and began to study his every move. They found evidence. Blake was passing materials to the KGB that could cost British agents their lives. When the security services were 100% certain, he was summoned for questioning. At first, he denied his guilt, but under pressure from the facts, he confessed that he had been working for Soviet intelligence for many years. After his arrest, the court sentenced him to 42 years in prison, one of the longest sentences for espionage in Britain. He was sent to Wormwood Scrubbs prison in London. It seemed that he had no hope of ever being released. But Blake was a man who did not give up. In prison, he met other inmates and found those who were willing to help. Outside, he had allies who planned everything down to the smallest detail. In 1966, just 5 years after his sentence, Blake chose the moment when the guards least expected it. He climbed over the wall with the help of a rope made from bed sheets and found himself on the other side. His friends hid him in a car and secretly drove him out of London. He then crossed the border into Europe and made his way to East Berlin, from where it was easy to the USSR. There, he was welcomed as a hero, while the British authorities were left in complete shock. George Blake went down in history as one of the most effective double agents, whose actions led to the long-term weakening of British intelligence. His story is a reminder of the fragility of trust and the consequences of ideological differences during the Cold War. Subscribe to the channel and don't forget to like.